The Indiana sky was a brilliant azure without a single cloud to mar the dome of heaven. Birds were singing in the boughs among the new leaves that were opening, and the crocuses, narcissus, and daffodils were in bloom. It seemed that all of nature had joined in some baneful plot to mock my sorrow. I got in the back seat of my son's car, and we slowly pulled out of the cemetery. Sally turned around in her seat to look at me sympathetically. She reached her arm over the seat and clasped my hand. "It was a beautiful ceremony, Mr. Moore. I know Madeline would have loved it." I didn't say anything. Maddie had been a happy person, one who loved nature. Or at least she had before Grace left. Terry glanced back at me, and I could see his eyes were red too, but he tried to be supportive. "Sally's right, Dad. Mom would have wanted it to be just like it was today." I knew they were right. Spring was Maddie's favorite time of year. I guess if she had to go, this would have been the time she would have chosen. Still, that's little consolation when you've just buried the wife you loved for 35 years. Terry parked in front of our house, and he and Sally walked with me into the house. I sat down heavily on the couch. They looked at me anxiously. "Did you ever hear anything from Grace?" I asked. Terry looked down at the floor. "No, not a word." I nodded. I had been certain of the answer, but I couldn't stop myself from asking. In the silence, Terry shifted uneasily and then asked, "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" How do you answer that? I asked myself. Nothing is ever going to be okay again, but I can't say that to my son. It would only increase his anxiety about me, and he has his own grief to deal with. "I'll be okay," I told him. "It's going to be pretty strange living here without her, but I plan to keep busy, and that will help." "That's good, Dad," Terry responded. "Listen, we've got to go pick up Lance from the babysitter now, but if you need anything at all, please call me." Rising to see them off, I nodded. "You two take good care of my grandson," I told them. After they had gone, I stood there and looked around at the home Maddie and I had shared for so many years. It was filled with memories, some good, some not so good, but it had always been filled with life, and now, well, not so much. The day was still bright outside, but the light coming through the windows seemed to lose its intensity as it entered. I sat back down and began to remember. My thoughts drifted back to when we bought the house all those years ago. In truth, it had been too big and too expensive for a young couple like us, just getting started. But we fell in love with the place the moment we saw it, and nowhere else would do. So we pulled all of our savings out of the bank, and my father loaned me enough in addition to make the down payment. Even then, the monthly payment was more than I could comfortably handle. So Maddie went out looking for a job. She was fortunate enough to find one in the development office of the city's art museum. She was always good at communications, both written and oral, and with her love for art, it was a perfect fit. I guess you'd say we were house poor. Each month we had very little money left over after paying the mortgage and utilities. But we didn't care. We were madly in love and on our way to the American dream. We might not have been able to go out to dinner and the movies, but we compensated by making love in every room in the house. Maddie always had a strong libido, and she'd get in the mood at the drop of the hat. Sometimes she nearly killed me, but what a way to go. With all the sex we had, it wasn't surprising that Maddie got pregnant with Terry the second year after we were settled into our new home. It was a difficult delivery. Maddie was in labor for 18 hours. But then we had this wonderful new life in our arms and suddenly everything was perfect. Terry had been a good baby, sleeping through the night within 6 weeks, no colic, none of the problems so many newborns have. As he grew, he continued to display that same good health and happy disposition. So much so that Maddie felt comfortable about going back to work when Terry was 9 months old. The museum thought so highly of her that they had held her job, so we made that transition with remarkably few difficulties. Having an infant in the house curtailed our love life, of course, but only somewhat. We still managed to make love frequently once Terry began sleeping through the night. And whenever Maddie would have to travel on one of her fundraising trips to other cities, she'd come home in a frenzy. I knew I would get little sleep the first night she returned. Terry had come pretty early in our marriage, but it was 5 years before our next one. Maddie wanted to wait. Part of her decision was based on the success she was enjoying in her work. By then, she had been named to head the development department, and she loved every part of it. Schmoozing with Fat Cat donors, planning fundraising events, and holding the annual membership campaign. But I also think that the delivery of Terry had been daunting enough that she just wasn't ready to undergo that again anytime soon. In truth, we weren't even trying when Maddie became pregnant. But as every gynecologist knows, babies have a way of sprouting when they want to, regardless of the intent of their parents. And so Grace arrived almost exactly 5 years after Terry. But unlike her brother and despite her name, Grace was a trial from the moment she arrived. She cried when she was born, and it seemed she never stopped, except when she was sleeping, which happened sporadically and only for short periods of time. We had secretly prided ourselves on how well Terry had done and what an easy baby he was. Grace humbled us. She cried. She spit up. She had diarrhea, and then she cried some more. Many times we were at our wits' end, but somehow we came through it with our sanity and marriage intact. I think it was harder on Maddie than it was on me. Somehow, Grace seemed to be on her better, never best, behavior when I held her, fed, or changed her. But when Maddie took her, little Grace fought and cried and was generally on her worst behavior. She was almost 9 months old before she began sleeping through the night. The pediatrician told us that some babies are just more difficult than others. If so, then Grace must have been the model of a difficult baby. As she grew older, we could tell that her personality was very different from her brother's. Where Terry was calm and quick to become absorbed in his activities, Grace was constantly active, frequently shifting her attention from one thing to the next, needing attention and demanding to be diverted by something different. When she reached her second birthday, we learned the true meaning of the terrible twos. Worse, she didn't seem to grow out of that stage, even when she hit 3 and beyond. No became her favorite word, and she proved to be both willful and unbending. Are you sure we brought the right baby home from the hospital? Maddie would ask me some nights when Grace had proved unusually difficult. Another striking difference between our two children was their performance in school. Right from the beginning, Terry displayed the need to achieve that often characterizes firstborn children. As my father would say, he took to school like a pig to mud. He was not a genius, but he was a good student who always worked hard, and all his teachers praised him when we went to parent-teacher conferences. Grace, in contrast, was an indifferent student. That's not to say she was slow. In fact, she was highly intelligent, perhaps in some ways even more so than Terry. If a subject interested her, she would throw herself into it without reservation, often making the top grade in her class. But she had no interest in nor patience for subjects that did not appeal to her, and it was virtually impossible to motivate her to put any time or effort into them. As a result, she would excel in certain areas but fail in all the rest, bringing her overall grades down dramatically. Maddie and I were dreading the time when Grace reached her teenage years, and our fears proved well-founded. The rebellion and independent streak that had burned within her as a youngster became a raging conflagration when she hit 13, and it got worse from there. She was impudent, insolent, and frequently disobedient. When we grounded her one time when she was 16, she snuck out of her room, took one of our cars without permission, and went out drinking and dancing with her friends. When she came home at 3 in the morning, she was so drunk she could hardly stand. Yet she somehow managed to get the car and herself home in one piece. I guess the Lord really does watch over drunks, fools, and children. Despite everything, Grace made it through to graduation, and while she certainly didn't distinguish herself academically, she did earn her high school diploma. Her transcript wasn't going to get her into Harvard, but at least she had the possibility of going to community college and maybe transferring to a better school after her sophomore year. At least that was our plan. But her achievement had lulled us into a false sense of optimism. Shortly after her graduation, Grace and her mother had a huge fight. I wasn't there when it started, so I don't know who threw the first verbal punch, but I heard the yelling and walked into the room just in time to hear Maddie shout, "I am your mother, and I will not accept that kind of lack of respect from you, young lady." To which my daughter replied in decibels every bit as high, "You're not my mother, you're a witch." Both Maddie and I were stunned, but before either of us could react, Grace burst into tears and ran up the stairs to her room. I heard the door slam, and when I tried the handle, it was locked. I knew I could open her door with the master key, but I decided a cooling-off period was better than forcing an immediate confrontation. I wish now that I'd taken the other option. We didn't see Grace the rest of the afternoon, which was just as well because Maddie was almost hysterical. I had to devote all my energy to consoling and calming her as best I could. Grace didn't come down for dinner, and we figure she was on her phone with her girlfriends bemoaning how badly her parents treated her. After the episode with the stolen car, I had made it a point to keep all the car keys in our room, and I checked them before I went to bed. I didn't sleep well, and twice got up during the night just to be sure that Grace was still there. Sometime after midnight, I fell into a troubled sleep. When I finally woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was to walk down the hall to check Grace's room. I was relieved to see her door was still closed, and turned to go back to our bedroom. But something made me double-check, and when I tried the doorknob, the door swung open. Her room was as chaotic as always, but Grace wasn't in her bed. I quickly ran downstairs and checked the rest of the house. No Grace. Then I went out to the garage just to make sure the cars were still there. They were. I came back in the house, planning to go wake Maddie and tell her what I discovered, when I noticed my wallet sitting on the breakfast room table. I was sure I'd left it on my dresser the night before. When I opened it, I noticed two things. I'd gotten $500 out of the bank earlier in the week. Now it was gone. Then I saw the note folded up where the bills had been. I recognized Grace's scrawl. "Sorry, Daddy. I took the money. I'll pay you back someday." I quickly grabbed the telephone and called the police. "I want to report a missing person," I told the desk sergeant. He wanted to know her age and how long she had been missing. When I told him she was 18 and that she'd only been gone a few hours, he wearily explained that A, she was an adult and could come and go as she pleased, and B, in any case she couldn't be considered missing until she had been gone more than 24 hours, unless there was evidence of a crime. I decided not to mention the money Grace had taken. Maddie had come downstairs sometime in the middle of my conversation, and as she picked up on the gist of the discussion, she began frantically tugging at my sleeve to find out what was going on. I pulled out the note from Grace and handed it to her. She began to weep when she read it. I turned back to the phone. "Look, Sergeant, I don't know whether you have a kid or not, but if you did and he or she ran away like this, what would you do?" There was a pause and his voice lost all its boredom and became human. "The first thing I'd do would be to call all her friends and see if any of them know where she might be headed. If that doesn't turn up anything, I'd check the bus terminal to see if she might have caught one. A lot of runaways do because it's cheap and there's no hassle at the gate. And if you haven't done so already, try to call her on her phone. If she doesn't answer, leave a message for her. That's what I'd do." I thanked him and hung up. I wondered if he might have a kid Grace's age. I called Grace's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. "Grace," I said, as calmly as I could under the circumstances, "please come home. I'm so scared for you, baby. If you can't get home, I'll come get you wherever you are. If you don't want to come home, at least call and let us know you're all right. Please, baby. Mom and I love you so much, and we're so scared, baby. Please." Maddie and I began calling every friend of Grace's we could remember. No one knew where she might be going, or if they did, no one would admit it. We called Terry, who by then had graduated from college and had a wife of his own, but he hadn't heard from her either. Terry and Grace weren't real close, but they were closer to each other than she was with us. He promised to let us know immediately if he had any word. Then we drove down to the bus depot, hoping against hope that she might still be there. She wasn't, and none of the people at the ticket windows remembered selling a one-way ticket to an 18-year-old girl. The next few days were a nightmare. After the requisite 24 hours, we officially reported Grace as missing. The police warned us that they couldn't make her come home since she was legally an adult, but they promised to search for her nevertheless. We learned about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and registered Grace with them. We learned about support groups consisting of parents of missing children. We were horrified to learn that some 850,000 new names are added to the missing persons list each year, almost two-thirds of which are 20 or under. But we also found that a nearly equal number of entries are cleared each year as individuals return home or are otherwise removed from the list. That gave us hope. I contacted a detective agency to see if they could help. The agent I spoke to was very sympathetic, but not very encouraging. Indianapolis is surrounded by major cities within a few hundred miles in all directions, and every one of them has a sizable population of runaways and the homeless where she could disappear. Even if we knew where she'd gone, we'd have a hard time tracking her down if she doesn't want to be found. I'll be honest with you, we don't like to take cases like this because it's so rare that we have any luck. If I were you, I'd keep doing what you're doing now. You're just as likely to find her that was as with us. I left his office an anxious and discouraged man. About 2 months after Grace disappeared, I was working in the office one day when my cell phone rang. "Hello," I answered, only to hear a quavery female voice. "Daddy?" "Grace," I yelled. "Where are you, baby? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Daddy," she replied. "I'm in a safe place. I just don't want you to worry about me." "Come home, Grace," I pleaded. "Or tell me where you are, and I'll come get you." "No, I can't, Daddy," she said. "It's all too weird. I'm going to stay where I am." "Oh, baby, please come home. Mom and I miss you so badly." "I'm sorry, Daddy, I can't. Listen, I just wanted you to know I'm all right, and you don't have to worry about me. I'll call you again when I can." And with that, she was gone. I left work and drove over to the museum to see Maddie. I didn't trust myself to tell her over the phone. When I walked into her office, Maddie saw me and put her hand to her mouth, her eyes widening in fear. "No, it's good news," I said hastily. "I just had a call from Grace." With that, Maddie dropped her head to her desk and began to sob. I walked around to hold her. When she regained control, I told her what had happened and what Grace had said. But when's she coming home? Maddie demanded. She's got to come home. I sighed. Honey, she said she was in a safe place and she's going to stay there for now. She said it's too weird for her to come back home right now. Maddie began to cry again. She hates me, she sobbed. I drove her away and now she's punishing me. No, honey, no. She's confused and unhappy, and neither of us knows what's really going on with her. You've got to stop beating yourself up. That argument you and she had wasn't the cause of her leaving. It was just a symptom of all her confusion. You've got to believe that. I don't think Maddie bought my hypothesis, but she did calm down, and the two of us were able to take some comfort in knowing our daughter was alive and seemed to be okay. That set the pattern for how our lives continued. Every few months, I'd get a call from Grace reassuring me that she was all right. She never asked for money, she never told me where she was, and she would never agree to come home, no matter how I begged. Occasionally, Terry would let me know she had called him, always with a similar message. But she never called Maddie, and although I tried to downplay the obvious, I knew it always hurt Maddie that her daughter wouldn't speak to her. We were never at peace with the situation, but after several years went by, we did achieve a measure of acceptance. Our daughter didn't want us in her life, and there was nothing we could do about it. We still worried about her, especially when the interval between calls would stretch out longer than normal, but wherever she was and whatever she was doing, she seemed to be safe as far as we could tell, and we clung to that belief for our own mental health. But our comparative peace didn't last long. A new threat arose. Maddie came home from one day from a routine mammogram with the worrisome news that the doctor had found a lump. He wants me to have a biopsy, she told me. I felt a clammy sweat break out on me, even as I tried to soothe her. It's probably nothing, honey. These days, they have to test everything for defensive reasons. You'll see, I told her as I held her, but I don't think she believed my words any more than I did. Somehow, Maddie and I had become characters in some ancient Greek tragedy, and the gods seemed in a particularly vengeful mood. My sense of doom was heightened when we got the results from the pathology lab. The lump was malignant, with poorly differentiated cancer cells. Further testing revealed that the cancer had spread to the lymphatic system. I was devastated, but I knew I had to be strong for Maddie because she would need all the strength she could get. We're going to fight this thing, I told her. It's not a death sentence. Lots of women come through it and live long, happy lives. Maddie's oncologist was a no-nonsense type. We're going to treat this aggressively, he told us. I don't want to take a gradual approach and run the risk of this thing getting away from us. When we learned what aggressive meant, Maddie turned pale, and I thought for a moment I would pass out. She would have to undergo a mastectomy and the removal of her lymph nodes, followed by both chemotherapy and radiation. We both cried when we got home from the doctor's office, and I cried again when I had to call Terry and tell him. The next act in our little drama featured scenes of darkness and light. The light came from the support groups we joined and the encouragement of our friends. They helped sustain us and keep our spirits up with their sympathy and understanding. But the surgery and follow-up treatments were very dark indeed. Losing her breast hit Maddie especially hard. She was a beautiful woman and had always been especially proud of her breasts. They were one of her best features. Although I tried to hide it, her surgery hit me equally hard. I'd always loved her breasts, and the idea of her being disfigured was difficult for me to accept. But I told myself to grow up and quit feeling sorry for myself. I wasn't the one fighting for my life, and I wasn't going to do anything but be positive and upbeat around her. Once we get this thing licked, I promised her, you can get reconstructive surgery. They can do wonders now. You'll be the envy of all your friends. But when the gods become angry at mortals, they are not to be appeased by acts of courage and displays of optimism. When we learned that the cancer had metastasized aggressively to other organs, Maddie lost the will to fight. I don't want to go through any more surgeries, she told me. I don't want any more chemo or radiation. I've had enough. I begged and pleaded with her not to give up, but she was adamant, and I really couldn't blame her. I'd seen how weak she'd been after the surgery, how sick the toxic chemicals they'd injected into her body had made her. No one could fault her for not wanting to keep going through that with very little likelihood of success. I thought there might also be another factor, though I didn't want to mention it. I feared that Maddie viewed her cancer as some sort of punishment for what had happened with Grace. Maddie never said anything like that, but I couldn't help but wonder if that was part of the reason she declined further treatment. Once we stopped all treatment, things began to change very quickly. Maddie would have good days when she would seem almost normal. I remember taking her to a flower show and rejoicing in the pleasure she took in seeing a ray of blooms. Other days, she would scarcely be able to lift her head, and I could tell that her strength was draining like water from a cracked glass. In the last days, I moved her to hospice care. Most of the time, she simply slept, an uneasy, unrestful sleep. When she was awake, she had things she wanted to say, but she didn't have the energy for long conversations. "Raleigh, you know that I've always loved you," she told me on more than one occasion. That made me sad, because I had always known that. There was no reason for her to feel she had to keep reassuring me, but I only replied that I knew she did, and that I had always loved her equally as much. On her last day, she roused herself again to take my hand. "Grace," was all she said, but I knew what she was asking. I could do nothing but shake my head. "Tell her I'm sorry for everything," she murmured before slipping back into sleep. She would not awake. Later that night, she went into Shane Stokes' breathing, and then she was gone. The gods had had their vengeance. I shook myself from my reverie and looked around our quiet home. Now that she was safely buried, there was nothing more I could do for her. It was time for me to go on with my life. Those were brave words, but they didn't match my mood. There had been times when I wondered how I could go on after losing the two most important women in my life. But that was just self-pity talking. I had a son with a wife and a son of their own. I knew they loved and needed me, just as I needed them. Life might have lost its zest, but I had no right to think about giving up. The next few weeks were filled with a new set of hurts and indignities. The pain came from the need to clean out Maddie's things, especially her clothes, cosmetics, and other personal effects. I knew I had to do it. I didn't want them to become some pathetic, dusty shrine. But every item I packed had its own set of memories, and the relatively simple task took me days to complete. The indignities were inflicted both actively and passively by the friends, acquaintances, and colleagues I interacted with over the next few weeks. The museum where she had worked sent a delegation over to express their condolences, and while I appreciated the gesture, I hardly knew any of the people. The signed calligraphic memorial they presented me with was an embarrassment. What was I to do with it? Hang it over the fireplace? Many of our friends stopped by to check on me, but they had no idea what to say to me beyond the cliched phrases everyone uses. Likewise, I had no idea what to say in return other than to employ the equally tired responses. Worst of all were the people who couldn't think of anything to say and, in their embarrassment, would avoid me. I'd see them shaking their head or casting worried glances in my direction when they thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't fault them. Sometimes there's just nothing that can be said. I'd taken to visiting our minister at church during Maddie's illness, and now that she was gone, I found I needed to keep going. Our minister was a wise and lovely woman who let me pour out my grief in her little office over a cup of tea. In addition to spiritual comfort, she proved to have great insight into human nature. It was she more than anyone else who helped me get past my self-pity. But when I went to see her this Friday, I had a new problem to deal with, one that both troubled and shamed me. After she had poured me a cup and settled back in her swivel chair, I began to make my informal confession. I had a nightmare last night. I dreamed that Maddie was alive, but she wouldn't come to me. I was lying in my bed, but I was helpless and couldn't get up. Maddie just laughed at me and went out the door, never even looking back. I was so angry at her that I felt like I hated her at that moment. I looked up at the Reverend's thoughtful face. What's wrong with me? How can I be having feelings like that? She took a sip from her cup and looked at me intently. Raleigh, what you're feeling is entirely normal. Nobody likes to talk about it, but I dare say most of the people who lose loved ones experience feelings of resentment and anger toward them at one time or another. But how can that be? I demanded. She's dead, for God's sake, while I'm still alive. She should be resenting me, not the other way around. But don't you see, she said quietly, she left you alone in all your pain and sorrow. The more you loved her, the more you miss her, and the more it hurts. And the source of all that pain is Maddie. Is it any wonder you feel some resentment toward the person who's causing you to grieve and suffer so terribly? What she said made sense in a twisted sort of way, but I still wasn't happy about it. What can I do to make it go away? I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating my dead wife. The minister gave me a little smile. You don't need to worry about that, Raleigh. The reason you feel anger now is that you still haven't accepted the fact that Maddie is gone. It's all still too fresh and raw. Once you get to the point of acceptance, you'll find that the anger is gone too, and you'll be able to focus on the good memories. When I left her office, I hoped that she was right. It was very disconcerting to find myself hating the woman I'd cherished for so many years. I was glad I'd had the appointment with our minister that day because I was invited to have dinner with Terry and his family that night. The last thing I wanted to do was visit them with all that anger unresolved in my heart. Little did I know the next scene in my drama was just getting started. After dinner, Terry and I sat out in the den. Sally made a point of leaving us alone, saying she needed to put their son Lance to bed. "What is it, Terry?" I asked him. "I can see there's something you want to tell me." He shifted nervously in his chair and cleared his throat. "It's Grace," he said. "I've heard from her." Instantly, all the anger that the minister had managed to ease that afternoon came flooding back. But this time it had a new target. "Did you tell her?" I demanded. "Did you tell that her mother is dead?" He looked at me uneasily. "Yeah, Dad, I told her." "Well, what did she have to say?" I said, more loudly than I had intended. "She knew Maddie was dying. Couldn't she have even come to her mother's funeral?" "She cried when I told her," Terry answered. I looked at him expectantly. "There's more, isn't there?" I prompted. His face took on a guilty appearance. "She made me swear not to tell you, Dad, but I just can't keep that promise. I know where she is." I sat there dumbfounded. "After 5 long years," Terry went on, "when I told her about Mom's death, she asked me to send her something of Mom's she could keep. I got one of Mom's crosses from the stuff you gave Sally and sent it to her. Dad, she's living in Chicago. I've got her address." He handed me a slip of paper. "Oh, and she's living under Mom's maiden name. She's Grace Campbell now." I took the paper with her name and address and saw that Grace was actually living in Skokie, just north of Chicago. I put the address in my pocket and stood up. "Dad, what are you going to do?" Terry asked in alarm. "There's only one thing I can do," I told him. "I have to go and see her." He looked at me in resignation. "I knew you'd say that." He walked me to the door. "Dad, don't do anything crazy." I looked at him solemnly. "I promise, son." As soon as I got home, I booked a motel near Grace's address. Then I headed for bed. It's about a 3-hour drive from our house to Chicago, and I wanted to get an early start. I had no idea how long I'd be staying, so I wasn't sure how much to pack. During the drive up, I kept thinking about what I wanted to say to her. After 5 years and all the things that had happened in that time, I didn't know where to start. I went through various scenarios in my mind. None of them seemed right. There were just too many things I didn't know. It was afternoon when I reached Skokie, so I decided to grab a bite to eat before going to her address. I wasn't really that hungry, but I knew that the acid building up in my stomach would eat a hole in the lining if I didn't put something down there to soak it up. When I reached her address, I was surprised. I'd been expecting a slum. Instead, I found myself parked in front of a pleasant complex filled with what appeared to be upscale townhomes. I was so bemused that when I got to the door and rang the bell, I had forgotten the speech I had intended to make to her. I could see an eye peering at me through the peephole of the door, and there was a long pause before it opened. There in the doorway stood my long-lost daughter. From a gawky teenager, she had grown into a lovely young woman, every bit as beautiful as her mother. She stood there eyeing me with a sour expression on her face. "I should have known better than to trust Terry," was all she said. At that, the temper I'd tried to suppress began to boil, and it was all I could do not to yell at her. Striving for control, I asked rather testily, "Is that any way to greet your father after disappearing for 5 years?" She heaved a sigh. "You're right, Daddy. I'm sorry. Please come in." She stepped back, pulling the door open wider, and I walked into her place. It was tastefully decorated, and the furniture appeared to be pretty new. The appearance of her lifestyle raised even more questions for me. What did she do for a living? How could she afford such a nice place? What had she been doing for the 5 long years she'd been gone? She motioned me to the sofa and seated herself in an armchair across from me. As I gazed at her, it struck me again how much she looked like her mother, and with that memory, all my hurt and anger came bubbling up again. "Why didn't you come home for your mother's funeral?" I demanded. She looked at me helplessly. "Daddy, I just couldn't. It was all so complicated. I just couldn't do it." "That's not acceptable," I said. "She was your mother, for God's sake." Grace just sat there, her eyes downcast. I tried to regain my composure. "She wanted to see you so badly," I said more gently. "Do you know what the last words she ever said were?" She said, "Tell Grace I'm sorry." Angrily, I brushed the tears that seemed to have appeared on my cheeks. "I don't know what you two were fighting about, but it could not have been so bad that you wouldn't even come to see her laid to rest." The tears were now running down her cheeks too. "But I couldn't," she said hopelessly. "If I had gone back, it would have meant I forgave her. How could I do that?" "Forgave her for what?" I demanded. "For the way she treated you," she snapped back at me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said angrily. "Your mother loved me and cared for me every day of our 35 years together. Even when she was dying, she kept telling me that over and over again." Now I could see anger rise in Grace's eyes, and it reminded me of the bad old days when she was a rebellious teenager. Maybe she did, Daddy, but she sure had a funny way of showing it. I could only shake my head. I don't understand a word you're saying, I shot back. She gulped and then the words came spewing out. Daddy, she was cheating on you. Didn't you know that? Didn't you at least suspect? I sat back heavily in my seat. I found it hard to breathe. No, that can't be true. Maddie would never have done that. How can you say that? But my words had no conviction behind them. Doubt was building in me even as I protested. It's true, Daddy. I heard her talking to him on the phone. I ditched school one day, and when Mom came in, she didn't know I was home. I guess she had to change for some big event at the museum, but anyway her cell phone rang and it was him. I heard her talking to him while she walked around her bedroom pulling out the clothes she wanted to wear. She talked about what they were going to do that night, and then she started talking about what she was going to do to him. She sniffled. Daddy. It turned into phone sex, and I heard every filthy word she said. I was reeling at the scene Grace was recounting for me, and I grasped for any straws I could find. Maybe it was a joke, sweetheart. Maybe she was just teasing him. But Grace had broken her self-imposed oath of silence, and now it was all going to come out. She interrupted my rationalization. No, Daddy, it was no joke. I know because the next day when she reamed me out about something, I confronted her. She tried to deny it, but when I began repeating what she had said to him, she had to admit it. I don't know why, maybe she was tired of living with the guilt, but she told me all about it. Who he was, how long it had been going on, how it had started. Then the determined look on her face seemed to dissolve, and the tears began to flow again. And when she was done, she told me I could never tell anyone. Not Terry, not my friends, and especially not you. She told me you could never accept it, that you would divorce her and break up our home. I couldn't do that, Daddy. I couldn't be the one to split up our family. With that, she put her face in her hands and began to sob. Despite my own anguish, I went over and knelt beside her chair so I could hold her. But I couldn't keep silent. What she had told me raised so many more questions. What happened after that? I asked her gently. I tried to keep her secret, Daddy, and I did for a couple of months, I guess. I was about to graduate, and I just wanted to get through that. She looked up at me, but it was so hard. Every time she kissed you, the only thing I could think of was what she told him she was going to do with her mouth. Whenever she had some event to go to at the museum, I'd wonder if it was just an excuse to see him again. And every time she came down on me for something I'd done, all I could think was, who are you to judge me? She grabbed a tissue and blew her nose. It got so bad I felt like I was going to explode. And then one day when she really got onto me, I did. That was the time you walked in on our big fight. I knew I couldn't stay there another day. I couldn't stay with Mom because I couldn't stand her lies and her "I'm so superior" attitude. And I couldn't stay with you because I knew I couldn't keep everything from you. And that would have been the end of our family. The only way out was for me to leave and get as far away as I could. She shrugged her shoulders. And that's when I ran away to Chicago. My mind was filled with more questions, but the first one that popped out of my mouth was, why did you go to Chicago? She looked at me like I was dumb. Because that's where he lives. Who? I said angrily. Where who lives? The guy she was sleeping with. You've heard of him, Daddy. Carlton Morrison. And suddenly it all started to fall into place. I'd never met Carlton Morrison, but I knew who he was. He was the wealthy commodities trader who was as famous for the starlets he used to date as for his patronage of the arts. I remembered that his first multi-million-dollar donation to the museum had been one of Maddie's early coups that marked her as a rising star in the development office. Now I wondered what she'd had to do to get it. Then another memory popped into my head. Back when we had been struggling financially, we'd had a stroke of good fortune that had really made the difference for us. Maddie came home one day to tell me that an aunt I'd never met had passed away and left her a nice sum of money. It was enough to let us get out of debt and get our heads above water financially. Now I had to wonder who was the real source of that money. But that can't be right, I thought. That was so long ago. I tried to remember when all that had happened. That would mean their affair started. But before I could remember, my recollection was interrupted by a stirring coming from the back of the house. Grace was up like a shot. Oh dear. We woke her up. Then she disappeared into the back hall. When she reappeared, she was accompanied by a beautiful little girl who must have been between 2 and 3 years old. She had lustrous brown hair that hung in bangs over her forehead and large brown eyes. But all I could focus on at that moment were those abnormally large elbows, the awkward angle of her lower limbs and feet, and the difficulty she had in walking, even with her mother's help. I fell to my knees and reached out to her. Hello, I said quietly, I'm your granddaddy. What's your name? Those big eyes looked at me for a moment. Then she said in a halting voice, Susie. Hello, Susie. Can I hold you? She looked back to see her mother smile and nod, then stretched her arms out to me. I gently picked her up and stood there, holding my granddaughter. Over her shoulder, I stared at Grace through brimming eyes. Why didn't you tell me? It was time for Susie to eat, and I did the best I could to help Grace feed her. Afterwards, the little girl wanted to go outside, so Grace got her stroller and put her in it. Then we walked along the sun-dappled sidewalk under the trees until we reached a small park. Susie cooed and talked to herself most of the way. There was a playground in one section of the park, and we watched half a dozen children playing on one of those slides that spiral down to the ground. One after another, they'd climb to the top of the ladder and then let go, spiraling down until they were dumped out onto the ground. Just like me, I thought wryly. As we strolled, I gestured toward the precious little girl in front of us with a questioning look on my face. Grace understood. It's cerebral palsy, she told me quietly. I nodded. I didn't know a lot about CP, but I did know that Susie would need special care for the rest of her life. I put my arm around my daughter. I'm so sorry, baby. Don't be, she replied evenly. She's my daughter and my responsibility. I've got it under control. I looked at her questioningly, but she seemed certain of herself. Some of my earlier anger resurfaced then, but I didn't want to alarm Susie, so I tried to keep my voice low. The least you could have done is let me know I have a granddaughter now. Grace looked at me sadly, and then led us over to a park bench. She and I sat side by side, and she rolled Susie's stroller back and forth in a gentle motion. The combination of the sun and the motion of the stroller seemed to have lulled Susie back to sleep. After checking on her daughter, Grace turned to me, and with a gentle expression, she said, Poor daddy, you just don't understand. Susie is not your granddaughter. Of course she's my granddaughter, I said indignantly. You're my daughter, and she's your daughter. That makes me her grandfather. She took my hand gently. You're my daddy. You'll always be my daddy, but you're not my father. I heard a roaring in my ears, or maybe it was the faraway sound of the gods laughing. That can't be, I gasped. I was there when you were born. Your mother and I made love. I stopped myself. Even at that moment, I found it difficult to talk about sex with my daughter. Grace shook her head sadly. I'm sorry, Daddy. I've seen the DNA test. I broke down and cried then. Finding my daughter after so long only to lose her again was just too much for me to handle. We must have made a strange picture. The older man hunched over crying bitterly, the younger woman with her arm around his shoulders trying to comfort him, the toddler napping in her stroller. I struggled to regain control of myself, but I still wasn't thinking clearly. But if I'm not your real father, who is? Grace just looked at me, and the pieces all suddenly snapped together. When did you find out? I asked her. Oh, not till after. Not till much later, she said. I wondered at that, but just then Susie began to stir. We really ought to get her home, Grace said, and so we started back. We didn't talk. I still had questions, but my misery was too great to ask them just then. It was becoming clear to me now. Maddie wasn't the protagonist in this little tragedy. I was. It was my role to be tormented by the gods, taking one blow after another. I thought about the often quoted line, those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. I could relate to that. I felt like I was clinging to sanity by my fingertips. Grace fixed us a simple dinner, and I again helped her with feeding Susie. After the meal, I held the little sweetheart in my lap and read to her from one of her favorite books. She pointed enthusiastically at the pictures as I read the words on the pages. After we put the little girl down to bed, Grace and I returned to the living room. The time spent with Susie had brought a brief respite from my mental turmoil, but now I needed answers to my questions. I wanted to find out what had happened to Grace during the 5 years when she gone missing. Tell me again why you ran away to Chicago, I started. It was simple, Daddy. I came here because I wanted to see him, to confront the man who had ruined my life and was threatening to break up my family. I had to know what kind of man could make Mom do what she did. So what happened? I asked. Well, finding him was easy. Everybody knew where Carlton Morrison lived. So I just marched right up to his mansion and demanded to see him. And when I told them I was Maddie Moore's daughter, he let me in. What did he have to say? Oh, he readily admitted that he'd been having an affair with Mom for years. He even said he hoped it would continue. He showed absolutely no remorse. I wanted to claw his eyes out. She sighed. But then he began asking about me, why I had come, what my plans were. When I admitted that I didn't have any plans, he offered to let me stay in one of the rooms in his mansion. He told me if I needed money, he'd pay me to do odd jobs for him. And I thought, why not? I had no place else to go, and he owed me for the hell he'd put me through. Besides, I thought that maybe by being near him I could understand more about why Mom had cheated with him. I shook my head. That's so hard for me to imagine. I told her, you living in the home of your worst enemy. She smiled ruefully. I know, Daddy, but you have to understand, he's a very persuasive man. He knows how to flatter you and joke with you until you find yourself doing what he wants. It's no surprise to me that he was able to date all those models and starlets. Even without his fortune, he's a charming companion. She looked down for a second. Daddy, it wasn't long before I began to understand how Mom could have been seduced. He has a way of getting you to talk about something, so that after a while you feel like it was your idea in the first place. Then he just tells you how smart you are to have suggested it. Her face darkened, and she wouldn't look at me now. Daddy, I don't know if you were aware of it, but I always felt like Mom and I were competing with each other. That was no surprise to me. One of the things I had noticed was that although Maddie and Grace would fight with each other like alley cats, Grace was always trying to emulate her mother. And when Maddie noticed Grace's efforts, she'd try to up the ante in one way or another. Oh yes, I'd noticed the mother-daughter competition. Grace still wasn't looking at me. So I started out wanting to find out what kind of man could seduce my mother. But after a while, I found myself wondering what she had done to seduce a man who could have virtually any woman he wanted. I began to feel sick. This couldn't be happening. Grace was crying again now. Daddy, I'm sorry. I did it. I began sleeping with him. I wanted to prove that anything Mom could do, I could do better. She might have taken Carlton Morrison for a lover, but I took him away from her. And I did, Daddy, but I paid the price for it. He made me do terrible things, things I'm ashamed of even now. There were other men, and women too, and— Stop, I shouted. I don't want to hear any more. I don't want to know. You slept with your own father? I raised you better. Then the energy went out of me like the air in a balloon that's been punctured, and I slumped back down on the couch. Grace had slept with her mother's lover, her own father. Not only had Morrison cucked me, he'd committed a grave sin with his daughter. Suddenly, a greater horror galvanized me. Who was Susie's father? I demanded. Grace began sobbing. I fell back to the sofa, unable to move, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. I thought distractedly about the slide at the playground we visited earlier in the day. It seemed there had been one more turn on the downward spiral, and I hadn't seen it coming. Finally, I roused myself from the sofa and went over to Grace's side. She was still crying, but I had to ask, did you know that he was your father? She hiccuped, but then recovered. No, I did not know till later. I never knew he was my father, she told me. I never even thought about birth control when we were together, and for a long time I was lucky. But then I got pregnant, and he demanded that I leave. I was heartbroken, but he wouldn't be deterred. He told me he'd take care of me, but he couldn't afford to have a pregnant woman in his house. It would be bad for his reputation, he said. She looked up at me again. I refused to go, and that's when he told me I had no choice because I was his daughter, and the publicity would ruin me. When I called him a liar, he had a DNA test run. When I saw the results, I knew I had to leave for my baby's sake. He told me they'd take Susie away from me if anyone found out. Something about Grace's story didn't make sense to me. Morrison had cucked me, but how in the world could he have known Grace was his daughter and not mine? Then another link clicked into place. Maddie, I recalled, had wanted a DNA test from me sometime shortly after Grace was born. She told me that it was recommended by the police, a way to prove identity in case something unthinkable ever happened to Terry or Grace. I'd never heard of such a thing, but the test was as simple as a swab to the inside of my cheek, so I went along with it. Maddie told me she would keep the records in the safe deposit box, in the unlikely event we ever need them. I had never looked at them, and I probably wouldn't have understood them even if I had. Now, I felt sure I had just found out what really happened. Grace saw me thinking and jumped to the wrong conclusion. Daddy, he may have been a shit, but at least he was honorable. He set me up in this townhouse and helped me to find a job. He also paid all the bills for Susie's delivery and her medical bills since then. How very generous of him, I sneered. He paid you to stay out of sight and hide his sin. Grace sat huddled in her chair like a small child. Now you know why I couldn't come home, Daddy. I knew you would hate me, but not as much as I hate myself, she sobbed. I thought about her living all that time with her guilt and self-hatred, and I realized that she was as much a victim as I was. As I held her, I knew what had to be done. I stood up. It's getting late, Grace. It's been a traumatic day for both of us. I need to get back to the motel and get some sleep. She tried to stop me. Can't you spend the night here, Daddy? I could move Susie into my room, and you could have the daybed in there. I know she'd love to see you when she wakes up. I forced a smile at her. I wouldn't dream of disturbing Susie. You guys go on to sleep. I'll be fine at the motel. She threw her arms around me and hugged me as though she never wanted to let go. I've missed you, Daddy. I really have. She pulled back far enough so that she could look me in the eye. I love you, Daddy. And no matter what, you'll always be my daddy. I hugged her back. Despite everything that had happened today, it still felt wonderful to be reunited with my lost daughter. As I started for the door, she grabbed my arm. Daddy, you're not going to do anything crazy, are you? I smiled at her. Terry asked me the same thing. I promised him I wouldn't, and I'll make you the same promise. Then I headed out the door. Sometimes a good parent has to lie to his children. When I checked into my motel room, I was exhausted, but the day's revelations wouldn't let me sleep. I wished that I could talk with our minister back home because I badly needed someone on whom I could unload the horrors that had befallen me. But there was no one in that motel room but myself and those laughing gods who kept finding new blows to strike at the hapless mortal. After tossing and turning, finally I could take it no more. I got out of bed and booted up my iPad. Then I went searching for information on Carlton Morrison, the antagonist who had stolen my wife, my daughter, and my now granddaughter from me. There was no dearth of information on the man some frustrated English major-turned-journalist had dubbed the playboy of the Midwestern world. Morrison, I learned, had inherited his initial fortune from his father. But unlike so many rich men's sons, Carlton had done very well in his own right. Taking a portion of his inheritance, he taught himself about the commodities market. Then, through a series of shrewd but daring moves, he'd managed to double his father's money during one of the periodic bubbles that arise in the commodities arena. He certainly wasn't on the scale of a Bill Gates, but he was nevertheless a very wealthy man. Then, as if guided by some sixth sense, he'd cashed out, leaving thousands of other investors holding the bag when the bubble inevitably burst. There was talk of an investigation, but as best I could tell, nothing had ever come of it. Instead, the young multimillionaire had switched his attention to the world of art, becoming a major patron while simultaneously dating some of the most attractive women in the public eye. The stories of the parties at his Chicago mansion were legend. The gossip surrounding his romantic exploits filled the pages of a dozen tabloids. But I noted with interest that there were very few recent entries, and I finally found a group of items with the explanation. Apparently, the playboy had suffered a stroke a year ago and had withdrawn from the public scene. That news gladdened my heart. Moreover, it gave me encouragement. In his weakened state, I thought, my revenge might be easier to extract. For make no mistake about it, revenge was what I meant to have. This man had wreaked unspeakable harm on me and my family, and I wasn't about to let him get away with it. Today's revelations had been like a series of hammer blows, each driving me lower and lower down the spiral, until I felt his murder was the only way I could end the pain. I knew that I wouldn't escape punishment for such a crime, but I didn't care. How can you punish a man who has already died? At least I'd have the satisfaction of knowing that I'd taken him down with me, and I already knew how to do it. My daughter had inadvertently shown me the way. I went back to bed and waited for sleep to come. Now that I had committed myself, I felt my resolve would surely bring the rest I so badly needed. Yet I found I still couldn't sleep. Instead, I kept thinking about the quotation that had come to me that afternoon. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. Was that to be my fate? Had I already reached the point of madness? Did I have to take that final step of murder? Once I had done so, there would be no redemption, no way back. Was I predestined to wind up this way, a mere pawn in some Olympian game? Or was there another way? I lay there pondering eternal questions for a long time. Then I fell asleep. When I awoke the next morning, I felt strangely refreshed. Perhaps making a final decision does that. Whatever the cause, it was a good thing I had gotten some rest because I had a lot of preparations to make. I worked all morning, stopping only to eat a little food when my stomach protested. By the time I had completed my preparations, it was noon. I packed up my belongings and went to the front desk to check out. The manager was on duty, and as he processed my bill, he must have noticed my original reservation. "We weren't expecting you to depart until later, Mr. Moore. Was everything satisfactory?" I smiled at him. "Oh, yes, everything was just fine." He thought he saw an opportunity for some repeat business. "Then may I help you with a reservation for your next visit?" "No," I said. "I'll never be here again." I saw the puzzled look on his face as I turned and left. The drive south from Skokie was pleasant enough. Traffic was lighter than normal on a Sunday. That gave me a chance to think about the women in my life. Maddie's infidelity had shaken me to the core. How could she say she always loved me when she had carried on an affair for years? And then there was Grace. I could understand the stresses that had caused her to run away, but I couldn't comprehend how she could wind up becoming the lover of the man who had seduced her own mother. And then there was poor little Susie, the only true innocent. Yet she too was a victim of the unholy relationship between her mother and that man. That man. Everything kept coming back to Carlton Morrison. He was, I realized, my mortal foe, the enemy of my family and the true antagonist in this drama. I had to deal with him. Unless I did, our wounds could never heal. That knowledge brought me a strange sense of serenity. When you reach the point when there's only one thing left to do, I guess it settles the mind. The Morrison mansion was located in the Lincoln Park section of Chicago. When I finally found it, I couldn't help but be impressed. The place was enormous, with a wall of stone and ironwork encircling the huge lot. The building was 3 stories high, clad in a gray stone veneer topped by turrets and battlements. The place looked more like a fortress than a home. There were no parking places on the street, so I parked in front of a fire hydrant. What did I care if the car got towed away? The main entrance was protected by a heavy steel gate. Instead of swinging open, it rolled to the side. I noticed the steel beam reinforcing the center of the gate. Nobody was going to ram their way through that. My plan was simple. I took my lead from Grace. She'd been able to get into his lair by appealing to both Morrison's curiosity and his vanity. I intended to use those same weaknesses to breach his castle wall. I walked up to the speaker box beside the gate and pressed the button. A disembodied voice demanded to know why I was there. "I'm here to see Carlton Morrison," I said confidently, looking directly into the closed-circuit television camera watching me. "What is the nature of your business?" the voice asked coldly. "I'm an old friend of Madeline Moore. I'm bringing a final gift from Maddie to Mr. Morrison. Tell him Madeline Moore sent me. He'll remember her." There was a long pause, and I was beginning to think my confidence had been unwarranted, but then the voice spoke up again. "Please proceed down the driveway to the front entrance. Someone will meet you there." At that, the massive gate began its slow roll until it was open wide enough for me to pass through comfortably. Once I had done so, the gate reversed course and closed with a metallic clang. When I reached the front entrance, the door swung open and a servant greeted me. "Whom shall I tell Mr. Morrison is calling, sir?" she asked politely. "The name's Raleigh," I said. Then I waited while she went to notify her master. The front hall she walked through was encircled by a spiral staircase. She opened the heavy double doors directly beneath the curve of the staircase and disappeared inside. As I waited, I looked up. The ornately carved staircase was massive, stretching up a full 3 stories. When I looked down, the housekeeper had reappeared at my side. "Mr. Morrison will receive you in his office, sir, if you'll just follow me." With that, she led me toward the double doors from which she'd just emerged. As we passed under the staircase, I thought to myself, so this is what's at the bottom. The room we entered was oak-paneled and dark. Even the huge leaded glass windows were insufficient to illuminate the place. Sitting behind a mahogany desk in front of the largest window was a man with the face I'd come to recognize from all those photographs I'd seen on the internet. His most distinctive feature was his full head of brown hair, combed across his forehead. I'll bet the women love to run their fingers through that, I thought. The housekeeper turned to leave, pulling the heavy doors closed behind her. As I approached the desk, he stood somewhat awkwardly and extended his hand across the desk to shake mine. Come in, old boy," he said. "Sorry I didn't come out to meet you. Suffered a bit of a stroke a year back, and I don't get around quite so well these days." I was amused at his affected English accent. His biography made it clear that his family had come over from Ireland during the potato famine. Oh well, I thought. The rich must have their little idiosyncrasies. As I looked at him, I thought I could detect some traces of his stroke. His left arm seemed to hang somewhat loosely, and the left side of his face seemed to sag just a bit more than his age would normally dictate. Nevertheless, he was still a handsome man, and it was easy to see how women might be taken with him even if he hadn't been rich. "So you're an old friend of Maddie's," he went on. "It was a shame about her passing. She was a beautiful, intelligent woman. I certainly miss her. Wish I could have come to her funeral, but with the stroke and all." He shrugged with a smile. I gritted my teeth as he rattled off his platitudes, but held my tongue. I would get my turn. He seemed to grow uneasy at my silence, and after a minute he spoke again. "Well, I understand you have something that Maddie wanted me to have. Is that right?" When I merely nodded, he went on, "Well, that's just like her, always thinking of others. She was always that way, don't you know?" As I thought back on what I'd learned this weekend, I wondered if Maddie had ever truly stopped to think about others. Maybe that wasn't fair. But if she did, it was only after she'd already done what she wanted to do, I thought bitterly. He cleared his throat. Ahem, well, what is it exactly that you have for me from her? Some sort of keepsake or a letter, perhaps? No, I replied, nothing like that, just a simple message. When I paused, he became impatient. Well then, what is it? I bent over the desk until my face was about a foot away from his. Just this, I said evenly, screw you. He pushed his chair back in surprise and alarm. Hey, he gasped. What is this? Then an odd look came over his face and he snarled, who are you, anyway? I noticed that his English accent had disappeared. I already told your housekeeper, I said evenly, but I think she misunderstood me. My name is Raleigh Moore. He flinched when he heard me. Then you must be Maddie's. I mean you were. That's right, I cut him off. I'm Maddie's husband. The cuck you thought you'd fooled for so many years. Only now I'm here, and now it's time for you to pay for what you've done. His face went pale, and he looked wildly around. His left hand tried to reach for the buzzer I saw embedded in his desk, but his movements were jerky and slow. Don't even think about trying to call for help, I told him quickly. I can be across that desk long before anyone could ever get here. He jerked his hand away. What do you plan to do, Moore? Kill me? Over a little affair that happened a long time ago? Do you really want to spend the rest of your life in prison just because your wife stepped out on you a few times? No, the adultery probably wouldn't be enough to do it, I replied. But the fact that you got my wife pregnant might whet my appetite, and the fact that I unwittingly raised your child as my daughter would certainly add to my motivation. Then, of course, you seduced my daughter. Make that your daughter, when she ran away to confront you. Oh, and there's also the little matter of her daughter, your daughter's daughter. Let's see. Infidelity, illegitimacy, incest. When you put all that together, life in prison doesn't sound so terrible to me. As I went through my list of grievances, Morrison grew increasingly agitated. Sweat began to run down his forehead and into his eyes. I leaned over his desk once again. When I went to bed last night, I was planning to kill you today. But this morning I came up with a better idea. I'm going to let you live so you can experience all the pain and grief and horror that I've gone through. His voice was a hoarse whisper. What are you going to do? Simple, I said. I'm going to ruin you. When I leave here, I'm going straight to the police to swear out a warrant for your arrest on a charge of incest. With the DNA test you and Maddie had done on Grace, and the one I'll have done on your daughter's daughter, I think a conviction will be a slam dunk. But a man with your fortune might be able to buy his way out of something like that. So I'm not going to take that risk. As soon as I leave the police department, I'm heading to the offices of the Sun-Times, and I'm going to give them the whole sordid story. Once I'm done there, I'm going to contact every tabloid newspaper and gossip columnist who's ever run a story on you, and let them know what kind of slime you really are. When I get finished, you're going to have to wall up that iron gate out front of your house, because every blogger in the world is going to be clamoring to get more dirt on you, and the paparazzi will be swarming to photograph your crippled body. And as for all your friends in the art world, once they learn what you've done, I'll bet they won't touch you with a 10-foot pole. They'll probably post your picture with their security guards, just to make sure you don't even get in the door of their museums. You'll go from being a patron of the arts to a social outcast, a leper shunned and reviled. As I was speaking, Morrison slumped lower and lower into his chair. It was clear that he could envision the fate I was predicting, and when I finished, he visibly shuddered. Suddenly, his right hand shot out and yanked open one of the drawers of the desk. Darting his hand inside, he pulled out a 9mm pistol, which he proceeded to point at my chest. You're an even bigger fool than I thought, Moore, he snarled at me. What's to keep me from shooting you right now before you get a chance to tell your story to the world? All I have to do is say you threatened me, and I had to defend myself. I wouldn't even be lying. I stood up straight. Go ahead and shoot me, Morrison. Be my guest. After what you've done to me and my family, I'm already dead. He was taken aback by my response, and he hesitated. But before you do, I want you to realize that shooting me won't do you any good, I went on. This morning, I sent the whole story to my attorney back home. If he doesn't hear from me by this afternoon, I've instructed him to give all the facts to the Chicago police and then to follow up with the Sun-Times and all the rest of the media. Your name is going to be dragged so deep in the mud that you'll never get clean, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. But what about Grace? What about my granddaughter? He pleaded. You're condemning them to the same fate as me. You don't want to do that. My daughter. I mean, your daughter. already hates herself because she feels so guilty about what she's done. Telling the truth is the only way I know to help her forgive herself. And as for poor little Susie, I seriously doubt that her name or picture would ever appear in any news media. Even if it did, that poor benighted child would probably never know about it, much less care. You've already done all you can do to us, Morrison. There's nothing you can do to harm us any more than you already have. The only thing left is for you to join us in the hell that you've made. But I have money, he exclaimed. Lots of money. I can make you a very rich man if you'll just forget about all this. I sneered at him. Your money won't give me back the love you took from my wife. It won't give me the daughter who should have been mine. And it won't give me the granddaughter I didn't know. Your money means nothing to me. As I stared at him, he slowly lowered the gun to his desk. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. There was nothing he could say. I turned to leave. I heard the movement behind me, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw him pick up the automatic again. I just kept walking. If he was going to shoot me, it would have to be in the back. Let's see him explain that one to the police. I laughed to myself. I reached the door and opened it without looking back again. Nothing happened. I stepped over the threshold and closed the door behind me. The housekeeper was waiting. Are you leaving now, Mr. Raleigh? Yes, I replied. I've done all I came to do. As I walked out the front door, the big steel gate began to roll back, and I started walking toward it. I had almost reached it when I heard a single shot ring out from within those gray walls. I just kept going. Unbelievably, my car was right where I'd left it. I pulled away from the curb, and as I drove, I rolled down the windows to let fresh air into the car. Maybe that would remove the stench of decadence and perversion that had clung to me from that dark room under the staircase. As I drove, I thought about what had happened. I knew that mortals couldn't best the gods, but at least I hadn't taken that last step down into murder and madness either. Then another thought struck me. What if I wasn't even the main character in the drama? Maybe the gods' target had been Morrison all along, not me. If that were true, I didn't know whether to be relieved or outraged. Finally, I decided it didn't matter. Either way, the play was finally coming to an end. When I reached Skokie, I had to drive past the little park where Grace, Susie, and I had walked the previous day. Looking out the side window, I spied a small boy who had climbed to the top of the spiral slide, but was now perched on top, afraid to make the descent. I pulled over to watch. His mother was standing at the bottom of the slide. It's okay, she said. It's safe to come down. He looked at her with wide eyes. Then he seemed to make up his mind and, releasing his grip, slid down the ramp. Sure enough, as he neared the end, his momentum slowed until he came to a safe stop at the bottom. He looked up at his mother solemnly, then hurried around to the ladder to begin climbing again. I smiled and restarted my car. I was ready to start over too. Grace must have been looking through the curtains because she opened the door before I could ring the bell. She rushed out and threw her arms around me. Oh, Daddy, I was so worried about you. I tried to call, but you didn't answer your phone. I was sure something had happened to you. I smiled at the irony of her words, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I put my arm around her waist and walked inside with her. You need to get Susie ready, I told her. I'm taking you home. I hadn't been bluffing with Morrison. I had emailed the whole story to my attorney that morning, but when I heard on the radio that wealthy philanthropist Carlton Morrison had been found dead in his home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, I told my attorney to leave the documents be. Morrison's suicide was sufficient expiation of his sins, as far as I was concerned. But I wasn't quite done with Mr. Morrison yet. The libertine had neither a wife nor a will, so naturally his relatives went into a frenzy over the prospect of dividing his estate. Imagine their dismay when my attorney came forward with Grace's DNA test. Under Illinois law, if a person dies with a descendant but no spouse, the entire estate passes to the descendant. Morrison had taken a terrible toll on my family, but when the final curtain fell, I was the one still standing on the stage. Moreover, I emerged with my life and my sanity, and I had the rest of my family back. Perhaps most important of all, I knew my precious granddaughter would never lack for any care or treatment she might need for the rest of her life. That was good enough for me. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.